Washington, come one and all. Welcome to the District of Columbia. Welcome to Washington, D.C. This is the place where dreams come true. Yes, the capital of the United States. We'll enter the heart of our nation. We'll see where our bills become law. We'll visit the side of the White House and monuments that bring awe.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was a little bit fun rap song. Welcome to Washington. Shoeless Jeff and Scott Free from Smart Songs I found on the internet. Welcome to Amazing Stories. I'm your host, Jess Peterson. Every year about this time in July, I like to do a patriotic program, and so this year is no exception to that. And we'll be doing a history of Washington, D.C. We actually planned to make a trip, my wife and I, along with my older daughter and her family, to Washington earlier this year, but we weren't able to do that because of the pandemic coming around. So hopefully we'll do that next year, but sadly I won't have my own pictures to put up and post this time. We'll have some pulled off the internet. And when you're talking about a lot of these stories, you're always saying that there's always a lot of stories within the story, and that's certainly true of talking about the history of Washington, D.C. So I've tried to cull it down as much as possible to where this won't go too long for you, and still get the essence of what we're talking about when we talk about Washington, D.C. So according to archaeological evidence, Native Americans settled in Washington, D.C. about 4,000 years ago. And by 1600, on both the Virginia side and the Maryland side, there were a number of tribes. The Patawomic, who were loosely affiliated with the Powhatans, the Deg, which spoke Algonquin, and the Piscataway, also known as the Kanoi, and they were Algonquin tribes themselves. The early Europeans came around the start of the 17th century, and they included Captain John Smith, who was the leader of the Jamestown colony. He explored this area around 1608. The first colonial proprietors of the land were George Thompson and Thomas Girard, and there's record of them buying some tracts of land in 1662. Several tracts of land. Blue Plains Tract, which is in the southwest quadrant of Washington, D.C. The Capitol Hill Tract, which is where Capitol Hill, the Capitol building, sits now, and some other tracts down to the Potomac River. As the Europeans arrived, of course, there was bound to be some clash with the Native Americans, and so in 1697, Maryland authorities built a fort in the current District of Columbia area. A couple of years after that, 1699, the Kanoi Indians, which were the ones that were having the most clashes with, relocated west, and there were really no more problems between the white settlers and the Native Americans after that. In 1745, a tobacco inspection house was constructed along the Potomac River, followed by warehouses and wharves and other buildings that were soon added, and the settlement began to grow rapidly. 1749, Alexandria, Virginia was founded, and in 1751, the Maryland legislature purchased 60 acres of land for 280 pounds and began the city of Georgetown. This was the furthest point upstream that ocean-going boats could navigate the Potomac River. What you're looking at now is the old stone house, which is located in Georgetown. It was built in 1765. It's the oldest standing building in the District of Columbia. Well, Georgetown grew into a thriving port, traded tobacco and other things from colonial Virginia. And you wonder now, okay, so how did this get to be our nation's capital? Well, when we think of the capitals of the United States, I think we have a tendency to think, okay, Continental Congress, they met in Philadelphia, and they probably stayed there in Philadelphia until Washington was founded, and they moved to Washington. Well, as you can see from the slide here, the United States actually had 8 different capitals over a period of time. Most of that time was either Philadelphia or Washington, but there were some others also, and particularly during the Revolutionary War, as different things were happening around Philadelphia. The British actually occupied Philadelphia at one time. The government would have to flee to different places, and so you see Baltimore there, you see Lancaster, Pennsylvania for one day, you see York, Pennsylvania, and those 4 in Philadelphia were pretty well through the Revolutionary War. Then even afterwards, 1783, under the Articles of Confederation, there was a mutiny in Pennsylvania, and a mob of angry soldiers began converging on the government to demand payment for services during the Revolution. John Dickinson was governor of Pennsylvania, and he failed to defend Congress, who was actually sympathetic with the protesters. Congress was forced to flee to Princeton, New Jersey. Then there was a time that, a small period of time, that the government was then in Annapolis, Maryland, followed by New York City, and then the Constitution came along laying down the plans for Washington, D.C. So in the Constitution, developed in 1787, Article 1, Section 8, gave Congress the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. James Madison explained in the Federalist Papers that there was a need for the national capital not to be in a particular state. Basically 3 reasons, and this was explained in Federalist Paper number 43. And of course, the Federalist Papers were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, and they were explanations of different parts of the Constitution. But Madison pointed out 3 things. If the capital were in a particular state, that state would have undue influence on the national government. If it were in a particular state, it would be too great a burden on that particular state to bear. And if it were in a particular state, it would be too difficult to change that if things went awry. For instance, if our national government had wound up in the middle of Virginia or South Carolina, say, and the Civil War came along, and there would have the necessity to move, there'd be a lot of problems coming there. So for those reasons, the Constitution said it needs to be in a section of land its own, ceded by states. But where to put it? Well, a lot of different proposals were out there. The Constitution does not have a specific site. There are proposals from Maryland, from New Jersey, from New York, and Virginia, wanting to cede particular pieces of land and have the national capital close to their state. The northern states particularly wanted it in a location of a prominent city. The southern states wanted it closer to the more agrarian part of the country, especially their slaveholding interest. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison came together at a dinner at Thomas Jefferson's house. Now, Madison was a very good friend of Jefferson's. Hamilton and Jefferson couldn't stand each other for pretty well their whole adult life. Hamilton had a desire that the national government assume the debts, the war debts of the states. Madison didn't want that. Particularly he being a Virginian. Virginia had paid off their war debts, and some of the other states hadn't. He didn't see why Virginia would have to therefore go along with the other states and assume part of that war debt. But what Madison did want, he wanted the national capital in the South. And so Jefferson, bringing them together, they discussed it during a dinner, and it was agreed that both of things would happen. The national government would assume the war debt, and the national capital would be moved into the South. So what site? December 23rd, 1788, the Maryland General Assembly passed an act to cede land to the national government. Almost a year later, on December 3rd, 1789, the Virginia General Assembly did the same thing. So on July 6th, 1790, the Residence Act mandated that the site for the permanent seat of government, not exceeding 10 square miles, which was what the Constitution said, be located on the River Potomac. Now, by the way, when I mention 10 square miles, it's 10 miles by 10 miles, so it's really 100 square miles that we're talking about. 10 miles square would be 100 square miles. Be located on the River Potomac at some place between the mouths of the eastern branch, would have been the Anacostia River, and the Conococheague Creek, which would be about 75 miles upriver from there. The commissioners could only acquire land also on the Maryland side for federal buildings. Now, the final site, as far as the upriver side, was just below the fall line of the Potomac, and again, this is the farthest part that ocean-going vessels could come inland. Now, George Washington wanted the city of Alexandria included, and so in 1791, by the way, 1791 is a very important year in the history of Washington, D.C. A lot of things happened getting Washington started in 1791. But Congress did amend the Residence Act in 1791 to include Alexandria, but they still required all the public buildings to be on the Maryland side, since after all, Washington and his family owned a substantial part of land just 7 miles from Alexandria, and so they didn't want it to benefit Washington's family unfairly. So if you'll note, the original boundaries included Virginia, that part of Virginia. Now they're only on the Maryland side. So what happened? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Also in 1791, a commission was appointed to supervise the planning, the design, and the acquisition of the property. It was made of 3 men. Thomas Johnson, who was the first governor of Maryland, was governor from 1777 to 1779. And then after serving on this commission, he would become an associate justice of the Supreme Court from 1792 to 1793. He's the gentleman on your left there. On the right is Daniel Carroll. Daniel Carroll was one of only 5 to sign both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. He was a congressman from Maryland. He was a cousin of Charles Carroll, and you may have heard of Charles Carroll if you've seen the movie National Treasure. Charles Carroll would have been that ancestor of the Gates family that had and helped hide the treasure map. And so he was a real man, and Daniel Carroll was his cousin. The third man we couldn't find a picture of, his name was David Stewart. He was an associate and correspondent of George Washington. So in September 1791, they named the federal district the Territory of Columbia, and the federal city, the city of Washington. Surveying began in 1791. This again 10 miles square, 100 square miles. The axes would be running north and south and east and west. The head surveyor was Andrew Ellicott. He is there on your top left. He, along with his 2 brothers, Joseph and Benjamin, were the main surveyors, and they hired an astronomer and a free African-American, Benjamin Banneker, to make observations and calculations. It took them 30 days to make the loop around the district, chopping down trees as they went. Also set sandstone boundary markers at or near every mile point along the sides of the square. So 40 markers in all, 10 per side. The first one was laid on April 15th, 1791. A lot of things in our history happened on April 15th, by the way. We'll run across another one in a minute. The first one was laid on what's now the grounds of the Jones Point Lighthouse in Alexandria. There are almost 40 markers that remain. 4 of them are replicas, so mostly the originals. And for the next year and a half, loggers would chop down trees for 20 feet on both sides of the boundary line, going that way for 100 miles. So it took about a year and a half to do that. This is Pierre Charles L'Enfant. He was a French-born architect, civil engineer. He served with Marquis de Lafayette as a military engineer in the American Revolution. He was appointed by George Washington in 1791 to devise a plan for the city. And so what you see behind him is a plan of the city intended for the permanent seat of the government of the United States. The grid would center on the United States Capitol that would stand on top of a hill. From there would be wide diagonal avenues that would cross the layout, and you can see possibly the larger streets there. And these would later be named for states of the Union. Then intersecting these would be streets that would run east, west, north, and south, and where they came together with the avenues, with the larger avenues, creating circles and plazas that would later honor notable Americans. In addition, there would be a 400-foot wide garden-lined Grand Avenue that was expected to run about a mile on an east-west axis, and that area is called the National Mall today. And then there would be a narrower avenue than the Grand Avenue that would connect the Congress House, the Capitol, and the President's House, the White House. And today that is Pennsylvania Avenue, which is in essence become Washington's Grand Avenue. In addition to the streets, there would be a system of canals traversing the city and entering both the Potomac River and the eastern branch, the Anacostia River. So on August 19th, 1791, the plan was presented to George Washington, but there began to rise some conflicts with the commissioners. There was a feud with Andrew Ellicott over the engraving of the plan, and ultimately Washington dismissed L'Enfant just not too long after that. Ellicott, the chief surveyor, revised the plan, and it was published in 1792, and the building of the city of Washington was begun. Begun in essentially a swampland, lots of mosquitoes, and of course the labor on it was done mostly, or very muchly, by slaves. But by 1800, the government had begun to move into the new city of Washington, and you can see a picture of Washington there as is represented in 1800. November 1st, 1800, John and Abigail Adams moved into the still incomplete White House. Lots of interesting stories there that we could go into, as with Abigail hanging the laundry in the East Room and some of those things. Type things. But the Adams only lived there for 5 months. Shortly after they moved in, Adams was defeated for the presidency by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson would then move in March. At that time, the change in administrations did not happen in January. They would happen in March because of the length of time that it took to travel and get the news around and form the new government. The next picture here is showing the Capitol when it was first occupied by Congress, again about 1800. And the District of Columbia Act of 1801, the district and the cities of Washington, Georgetown, Alexandria were all placed under the jurisdiction of Congress. And in 1802, the city was granted a territorial government, which would consist of a mayor appointed by the president. The citizens of the city relied on Congress for capital improvements, for economic development, but Congress really didn't have a whole lot of loyalty to the city, and they were negligent to provide support. But they did provide funding for the Washington City Canal in 1809. The earlier efforts to build the canal with private funding were not successful, and so construction began in 1810. The canal would open in late 1815, and it connected the Anacostia River with the Tiber Creek. It fell into use then later in 1850. Another canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, pictured here, was begun in Georgetown in 1828. Construction on that canal went westward through Maryland. The idea was to connect Washington with some of the other cities. As you know of the Erie Canal, where there was lots of building of canals during those days, thinking that it would be the main way of transportation amongst the cities. The C&O, the Chesapeake and Ohio, reached the city of Cumberland, Maryland, in 1850. But by that time it had become obsolete because the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O Railroad, had come into Cumberland in 1842. So it comes down to the War of 1812. Of course, the War of 1812 was not a war that was just fought in 1812. It went from 1812 to 1814. And in August of 1814, the British conducted an expedition that wound up burning the capital city. They first had a battle against American militia that had gathered at the town of Bladensburg, Maryland, to protect the capital, but they routed that militia. The militia fled, leaving Washington unprotected. President James Adams and the remainder of the U.S. government fled the capital, but shortly before the British arrived. And if you do a little bit of looking at your history, James Madison really was not a great leader during this time. His Secretary of State and the president to follow him, James Monroe, almost was president in his stead. The British entered, they burned the Capitol, they burned the White House, the Capitol building, the Arsenal, the Navy Yard, the Treasury building, and the War Office. Also burned the north end of the Long Bridge, which crossed the Potomac River into Virginia. They spared only the Patent Office and the Marine Barracks. And of course, you probably heard the story of Dolly Madison, how she rescued the Lansdowne portrait as the British approached the mansion. The Lansdowne portrait, as you can see here on the right, was a full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. Now, Stuart painted over 1,000 portraits in his life, including all 6 of our first presidents. He later started, but never finished, the Anathenium portrait of Washington, which is what appears on our $1 bill. And so Gilbert Stuart's impressions of what Washington looks like is what we most depend upon. If you look at some of the other portraits of Washington, you'll see a much different image than what you get from Gilbert Stuart. So Dolly wanted the painting to go with them, and but it proved pretty difficult for her to get the painting off the wall. It was just becoming impossible. So Dolly says, "Hey, tear the frame down," and they did. And they took the painting out of the frame. They started to roll it up, like you would tend to do with a picture. And Dolly says, "Stop! No, you can't roll it up. You may ruin it. Lay it flat and transport it like that." And that's what they did. So the British came and they took Washington, but Washington was ultimately saved because a hurricane struck, and the British retreated. In the 1830s, the railroads arrived. Here is a picture of Washington in 1833, as seen from the Navy Yard. The B&O, the Baltimore and Ohio line, opened from Baltimore to Washington in 1835. Further railroad developments came after the Civil War. There was a new B&O line that connected Washington to the west, and in the 1870s there was the introduction of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad. Now, soon after the federal city was laid out north of the Potomac, some of the residents of the south of Potomac and what had been Virginia began petitioning for Virginia's return, going back to Virginia jurisdiction. You see, the Resident Act, as I mentioned, had prohibited federal offices and buildings to be built on the south side of the Potomac, only on the Maryland side. And Alexandria's economy had pretty well stagnated. They had competition with Georgetown on the north side. Georgetown was favored, but that's where the congressmen and officials lived. Also, the Alexandria Canal that connected to the C&O Canal, connected it to Alexandria. It was needing repairs. The federal government didn't want to repair that. Alexandria was also a slave trading center. And there was rumors that the district was going to become a slave-free zone, and so they were anxious to return to a slave state. Also, there were rumors that Virginia, there was an attempt to make Virginia a slave-free state at that time. And so those in Virginia were looking at adding 2 new pro-slavery representatives from Alexandria in order to quell that change to non-slavery. Also, the Alexandria representatives had just felt they lost any kinds of representation at all, no right to vote at any level of government. So on July 9th, 1846, the area south of the Potomac, some 39 square miles, was returned or retroceded to Virginia, and that was effective in 1847. Now, a large portion of that retroceded land was on the state of George Washington Parke Custis. George Washington Parke Custis was George Washington's step-grandson, Martha Washington's grandson. Custis had subpoenaed for retrocession. He had helped develop the charter for the county of Alexandria, Virginia. And in 1857, upon his death, part of this estate went to his daughter, and she was eventually the wife of Robert E. Lee. And eventually, that part of the estate became Arlington National Cemetery, and that was done in 1864. So if you think of those things that we think are connected with Washington, D.C., you realize that a lot of them were out of the District of Columbia area. Alexandria is not in District of Columbia. Arlington, the city of Arlington, is not in District of Columbia. Arlington National Cemetery is not in Washington or the District of Columbia. And even later on, Reagan National Airport, International Airport, is not in the District of Columbia. So even though it's a national area, it's not as big as we think of sometimes. Along comes the Civil War area. In 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated at a still unfinished Capitol building. So if you look at the picture on the bottom left, that is a picture taken during Washington's first inaugural. The Capitol was incomplete. The Capitol Dome especially was incomplete. Lincoln insisted that the construction continue during the Civil War. He also created the Army of the Potomac to defend the Capitol. Remember now that the District of Columbia, one side of it's Virginia, slave state, part of the Confederacy. The other side of it is Maryland. Now, Maryland's a slave state, but they did not secede from the Union, but they still had sympathies with the South. And so you can see the little danger, or the big danger, that the city of Washington was in. So the creation of the Army of the Potomac, significant expansion of the federal government during this time, and needed to administer the war, needed to take care of some of the legacies of the war, for instance, veterans' pensions, national cemeteries, etc. And so this led to considerable growth for the city of Washington. April 16, 1862, the Compensated Emancipation Act abolished slavery throughout the District of Columbia. This was 8 months before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Picture you're seeing now is the Fort Stevens. Fort Stevens was one of a ring of military forts around Washington that mostly deferred the Confederate Army from attacking. But on July 11th and 12th, 1864, the fort was attacked by rebel soldiers, under Confederate General Jubal A. Early. The Union soldiers were able to repel them. And interestingly, President Lincoln came out, visited the fort during the battle, and just wanted to see what the battle was like. Lincoln was fortunate not to have lost his life at that point, but it wasn't but a few years later, April 14th, 1865, just a few days after the Civil War ended, that Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, shown there on the left, by John Wilkes Booth during the play Our American Cousin. He would die the next day, April 15th, again, 1865 at 7:22 a.m. They had taken him to the Peterson house across the street, and that is the picture on your right there. First American president to be assassinated, first American president for his family to feel assassination. Interesting enough, his son, Robert Todd Lincoln, that was not his only assassination. In fact, he was standing by also when James Garfield was assassinated, and in the city when William McKinley was assassinated later in the century. Well, after the Civil War, this is a picture of Washington about 1874. The District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871 revoked the charters of the city of Washington, of Georgetown, and Washington County and combined them all into a single municipality. It provided for a Board of Public Works to make improvements. And in 1873, President Grant appointed Alexander Roby, or Boss Shepherd, to the post of governor of this board. Shepherd instituted some citywide revitalization, paved streets, installed a sewer system, but he spent a lot of money. Congress did not like the excesses that they saw out of that, and so they abolished the position and went in favor of direct rule by Congress, replaced that board with a three-member board of commissioners, and one of those commissioners would be a representative of the United States Board of Engineers. This congressional governance would last for about a century. In the late 19th century, 1880, the Washington City Canal was covered up. The railroads expanding. There was no need for the canal. Portions of that canal still remain today. 1888, the first motorized streetcars came into service, and this spurred growth in the city of Washington beyond its original boundaries. This is Alfred Klus. He was a German immigrant, was one of Washington's most important architects. Between the 1860s and the 1890s, he constructed almost 90 public and private buildings throughout the city. As you can guess, his signature architectural use was red brick, and so the building on the bottom right is the Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, and then the building at the top is the Smithsonian Arts and Industries building. It's a good time to talk about the Smithsonian. This is two more of the Smithsonian buildings, the National Archives on top and the Museum of National History. Now, the Smithsonian came as a result of a bequeathment by the estate of British scientist James Smithson. You can see him pictured there. He died in 1829. His sole heir died in 1835. And in his will, he left a large endowment to the United States of America to found at Washington, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. So after his death, after his heir's death, the United States government went to England, and they came back with 105 sacks filled with gold sovereigns. Figure it is worth about $500,000 at the time. Today it would have been worth $14 million. You can thank John Quincy Adams, former President John Quincy Adams at that time. He was then serving in Congress, and he acted sort of a trustee for this money. He made sure that Congress didn't go spend this money someplace else, a rarity for any time period, and that it was saved for its intended purpose. So construction began in the Smithsonian in 1849. The first building was opened in 1855. Today it has 19 museums, 21 libraries, 9 research centers, and a zoo. It has additional facilities in Maryland, New York, and Virginia. Has 154 million items in it, and a $1.2 billion budget, and over 30 million visitors come to it annually. Probably not this year, but anyway, annually, generally. Going into the 20th century, in 1901, the Senate Park Improvement Commission of the District of Columbia was formed. This is also called the McMillan Commission. It was formulated for the development of the National Mall. The McMillan Plan was inspired by L'Enfant's 1791 plan of the city. That plan had never been completed, and it sought to emulate the grandeur of Paris and London and Rome and some of those other European capitals. It was also strongly influenced by the City Beautiful movement. This was an ideology that intended to build civic virtue in the poor through important monumental achievement architecture. Sort of an early form of urban renewal, they removed a lot of the slums around the capital, replaced them with new public monuments and government buildings. So let's go and see what they did to the National Mall. This, and we're going to go from right to left as we look here. And so on your right is the United States Capitol building. It was originally built between 1793 and 1811, destroyed by fire in 1814 by the British, restored in 1815 to 1819, and expanded and completed into the 1850s and the 1860s. Now, to its left, you can see a number of buildings highlighted there in yellow, and these are the Smithsonian museums. 11 of the 19 of them are on the National Mall. And so we're going to start counterclockwise, starting with the top right. You have the National Gallery of Arts. It was completed in 1941. Next to it is the National Archives, which houses a number of our important documents, including the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Magna Carta. The building was completed in 1935. To the left of it is the National Museum of Natural History. It was the first of the Smithsonian museums. This particular building was completed in 1910. And then next to it, to its left, is the National Museum of American History. It was first opened in 1964 as the National Museum of History and Technology, was renamed in 1980 and then renovated in 2008. Now, coming down on the south side, moving now from left to right, is the Freer Gallery of Art. That is a gallery that focuses on Asian art. It was completed in 1921. Right next to it, in fact, physically connected to it, is the Arthur Sacker Gallery. It also focuses on Asian art, and it was completed in 1987. Now, sort of in the middle between those is the Smithsonian Institution building, which is called the Castle, and you can see the castle in that picture. It serves as an information center and houses the administration for the Smithsonian. It is the oldest building. It was completed in 1855. To the right of it is the National Museum of African Art. It became part of the Smithsonian in 1979. The building was completed in 1987. It is mostly underground and connects with some of the other Smithsonian museums. To the right of it is the Arts and Industries building. It was originally known as the National Museum. It's the second oldest Smithsonian building. It was completed in 1881. To its right is the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, completed in 1974. And it emphasizes more modern art objects. And then to its right is the National Art and Space Museum, completed in 1976. Now, going on to the left from the Smithsonian is the Washington Monument. Construction began on the Washington Monument in 1848. It was halted between 1854 and 1877 due to lack of funds, due to the Civil War, and really a struggle over just who had control over it. Was finally completed in 1884. At that time, it was the tallest structure in the world, but it only lasted that for 5 years, and it was superseded in height by the Eiffel Tower. One of the interesting things that I always think about when I see the Washington Monument are the words that are on top of it. The very top words are Laus Deo, which means praise to God. Then moving on down the National Mall to the left, going all the way to the Potomac River, is the Lincoln Memorial. The building of the Lincoln Memorial was started in 1914 as part of the McMillan Plan. That construction was interrupted during World War I, and it was completed in 1922. And that completion of that building pretty well finished the entire McMillan Plan. And so that's your National Mall area. We'll mention a couple of other things here in a second that are also part of that. But if you go then to the green area to the north, you see the White House. And so you've got part of it going east-west, part of it going north and south. The White House was completed in 1800. There was a fire in 1814 and another fire in the White House in 1929 under Herbert Hoover's administration. The White House has 132 rooms, 35 bathrooms, 6 levels, 412 doors, 147 windows, 28 fireplaces, 8 staircases, and 3 elevators. It's been known through history as the President's Palace, the President's House, the Executive Mansion, and it was President Theodore Roosevelt who officially gave the White House its current name, and that was in 1901. And we think the name White House, it had been called the White House for a long time, but we think the name came from a part of the estate of Martha Washington. She owned a land, an estate called White House, and so that was probably carried over from her estate. White House was reconstructed during the Truman administration. It was last restored to a great extent during the Kennedy administration. So if you drop down from the White House all the way to the Potomac, then you find the Jefferson Memorial. The McMillan Commission had proposed placing a Pantheon-like structure on the site hosting the statues of the illustrious men of the nation. So the original plan was not for it to be a Jefferson Memorial. No action on that part of the plan was taken by Congress. And so between 1939 and 1943, this structure was built, basically to encourage patriotism during this time, encouraged by President Roosevelt. This was time of Depression, time of war. Jefferson's statue was not moved into that until 1947. That's when it became the Jefferson Memorial. Now, other notable memorials along the site, starting at the top, there's a picture of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That wall that holds over 58,000 names of men, women who had died in the Vietnam War was completed in 1982. It does not hold everybody's name who died in the Vietnam War because there were some families who requested that the names be withheld. The memorial around the wall also includes a statue of the 3 soldiers and the Women's War Memorial. Then below that, actually on the National Mall, is the World War II Memorial. It's the most prominent site of the newer memorials. That site was selected in 1995. Design was approved in 1997, and it was completed in 2004. Then below and to the right, a little to the right, is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. That was completed in 1993. And then along the Potomac, between the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial is the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. And I really like to see this sometime. It was completed in 1997. It holds scenes from the Great Depression, includes a statue of Eleanor Roosevelt, and it is the only presidential memorial to depict a First Lady. Then back up toward the National Mall area, just east of the Lincoln Memorial, is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and it was completed and dedicated in 2011. So talking about Martin Luther King, it's a good time to talk about civil rights in the city of Washington. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of substandard housing. Large portions of the population lived in what they called alley dwellings. And so in 1934, there was a creation of the Alley Dwelling Authority. This was an early example of a public housing agency. They were responsible for demolishing slum housing and building new units that were affordable, modern, and sanitary. And so there was a good step as far as we were concerned for civil rights. But there were some backward steps taken, such as in 1913 to 1917 under President Woodrow Wilson. He segregated a number of the federal departments for the first time since 1863. This policy of segregation would then hold for decades. That segregation included separate dining halls, separate bathrooms at the same time. But back on the positive side, the schools. Because the schools were under federal rule, the District of Columbia under federal rule, the schools, the public school teachers were considered federal workers, even though they were in segregated schools. And so they were paid on an equal scale with white workers. And so there were attracted there a significant number of highly qualified teachers. In 1848, President Harry Truman integrated the armed forces and federal workplaces, reversing what Woodrow Wilson had done. In 1954, the parks and recreation facilities in Washington were desegregated. Also in 1954, after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling by the Supreme Court, President Eisenhower desegregated the District of Columbia schools, the first in the nation to be desegregated. In 1957, Washington became the first major city with a majority African-American population. A lot of this migration to the city had come from the South during World War I, World War II, build-up of those defense industries, expansion of the government at the same time, and so you get the migration into the city and growth in the city, particularly the black portion of the city. On August 28, 1963, Washington took center stage in the American Civil Rights Movement with the March on Washington. And that was the day Martin Luther King Jr. did his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And what a moment. What a great moment for the Civil Rights Movement. Only to be followed 4.5 years later by his assassination on April 4th, 1968. And Washington at that time went in reverse, was devastated by riots that broke out in the U Street neighborhood and quickly expanded to other black neighborhoods. These riots would result in suburban flight by not only whites, but by middle-class blacks as well. They went out of the city core, but essentially part of this had already started because they had begun looking for newer housing in the suburbs. Late 1960s, early 1970s, businesses started leaving downtown, started leaving the inner city, searching for those suburban malls and basically following the residential move out themselves. The mark of the riots of the 1960s would scar those neighborhoods into the late 1990s, and of course now we have the 2020 protest, legitimate protest, and riots. The Black Lives Matter movement, the removal of historic monuments. It's yet to be seen what will happen to our nation's capital and through that. Going back to governance, the 23rd Amendment was ratified on March 29th, 1961. This gave the District of Columbia electoral representation for the first time. They received 3 electoral votes. They could get no more than the least populous state, and there are actually 7 states in the United States that only have 3 electoral votes, which would be 2 senators and 1 congressman equal to that. The 23rd Amendment was ratified by 40 states, and then afterwards the New Hampshire and Alabama ratified it. 8 states never ratified the 23rd Amendment, Texas being amongst those. In 1978, the District of Columbia Voting Rights Amendment was sent to the states for ratification. 16 states ratified that before the 7-year limit passed, but no more, the limit was passed, and so they did not, that amendment did not get passed, and it would have granted them representation in the House and in the Senate. But in 1973, a few years before that, Congress passed the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. This provided for direct election of the city council and mayor for the first time. And Walter Williams, pictured here on the left, was the first mayor. There have been 7 mayors since. All of them have been African American, and all of them have been Democrats. Among the major names you might recognize there is Marion Barry, there in the middle. He was the second mayor. He served 4 terms, 3 consecutively and then 1 non-consecutively. He was popular among lower income residents, especially for his summer youth employment program, and that is still in existence today. But in 1990, he was arrested and served 6 months for cocaine possession. Came back and won another term, his 4th term as mayor, But during that term, the city became insolvent. They lost their home rule authority, and Congress created the D.C. Financial Control Board. As part of that board, Anthony Williams, the man on the right, was a significant part of it. He was a Yale and Harvard University educated lawyer, and he became mayor between 1999 and 2007. He succeeded in balancing the city's budgets, pulled it out of its insolvency, substantial drop in the crime rate during that time, and the number of residents increased for the first time in 50 years. And so they got direct rule back again, thanks to Anthony Williams. Currently, the mayor is Muriel Bowser. She was elected in 2015. She's had a controversial administration, difficulties with animal control, city finances, rising crime. Of course, now the Black Lives Matter movement and what's that's going to result in. Washington continues today as well, being a sanctuary city. And over this period of time, basically starting in 2000, the African American population has actually decreased in the city of Washington, falling 7.3% as African Americans have begun to leave the city for the suburbs, and also they're migrating back to the south. At the same time, the Caucasian and the Hispanic population has increased by 17.8%. So it'd be interesting to see what comes in the future of that. September 11th, 2001, terror came to our nation's capital with the attack on the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia, not actually again in the city of Washington, but close nearby. Killed 64 people aboard the plane, 125 on the ground. United Airlines Flight 93 was expected to target either the White House or the Capitol building, and of course its passengers took it down and crashed there. This period of time we had anthrax attacks also in 2001, toxin ricin coming through the mails in 2003. In 2002, October 2002, Beltway sniper attacks, 10 random victims. 2003 and 2004, a serial arsonist setting over 40 fires. So through this time, you've got increased security looking for terrorists. You've got metal detectors, vehicle barriers, screening devices for biological agents. And you've got what's begun to be called Fortress Washington, or the walling off of Washington. Now, interest in statehood for Washington continues. November of 2016, a proposal was passed by the District of Columbia residents asking to make the District of Columbia the 51st state. Again, there's some constitutional difficulties involved with that, and it would take an amendment to the Constitution for District of Columbia to become our 51st state. I went looking for quotes about the city of Washington. I was looking for positive quotes on the city of Washington. Found a couple. Washington is a city of southern efficiency and northern charm. John F. Kennedy. Mark Twain says, there is something good and motherly about Washington, the grand old benevolent national asylum for the helpless. But most of the quotes I found about Washington talked about it being a city of controversy, a city of politics, a city of hypocrisy. And that's sad, because it is indeed a beautiful city. And I think it has reached in its looks, its grandeur, that they wanted to make of it being like London or Rome or Paris, a showcase of our American heritage. Well, I don't know what's good to hold for our nation's capital in the future. I want to say God bless Washington. God bless the District of Columbia and other American cities throughout this time. And God bless you and God bless America, and stay strong during this time. God's still in charge. May not seem it, but God's still in charge. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to Washington, come one and all. Welcome to the District of Columbia. Washington, D.C., this is the place where dreams come true. Yes, the capital of the United States. We'll enter the heart of our nation. We'll see where our bills become law. We'll visit the side of the White House and monuments that bring awe. Well, the national capital is not in any state. No favorites are made, no state can overtake. Located on the banks where the Potomac River flows. Where? Between Maryland and Virginia, Congress goes to be the spot for the country's headquarters. President Washington mapped out the borders, formed the new district. It was 1790, 68 square miles. You could say it's tiny, but it's one of the most important places on the whole earth. America's 3 government branches on the same turf. Wow. A sure way to go when you arrive inside the Capitol. Take the metro to Pennsylvania Avenue, the home of the president, the most famous resident. The White House, number 1600, it's elegant. Walking around inside it in a room called the East, you might hear a speech by the Commander-in-Chief. Welcome to Washington, D.C., this is the place where dreams come true. Yes, the capital of the United States.
Originally, our nation's capital was usually called Federal City. George Washington had a lot of modesty. He never referred to it as Washington, D.C. D.C. means District of Columbia. Columbia's poetic stands for America, derived from the name Christopher Columbus. A prideful time was the 1800s. It's when the Capitol building would rise. The House of Congress rests on the hillside. 2 chambers to separate its members. The House of Representatives from the Senators. Its large round dome catches all eyes. Atop there, standing against the sunrise, the Statue of Freedom, symbol for all people, reminds everyone that we are all
We'll enter the heart of our nation. We'll see where our bills become law. We'll visit the side of the White House and monuments that bring awe. There are many monuments so that we always will remember. Through the summer sun and in the dark of December, the people and events which have shaped our lives, ensuring we have freedom and our country thrives. 555 feet into the skies, a monument to George Washington we recognize. What lies across the way is the Jefferson Memorial. Sits inside a bay, reminds us of a man historical who toiled over the Declaration of Independence. With columns and a dome, his monument brings resplendence. Then it's to the Lincoln Memorial. There's a statue of Abraham Lincoln in a chair staring at you. Have you ever seen the V-shaped black marble wall? Soldiers who did fall in Vietnam, it names them all. There's a long pool of water to reflect the view, and a monument to those who fought in World War II. Welcome to Washington, D.C., this is the place where dreams come true. Yes, the capital of the United States.
As we continue to walk through the National Mall, take a glance and see where many did hear the call of voices and rallies, people demonstrating. Where I have a dream, said Martin Luther King. It's not a multi-shop, but a large green park outside nearby DC's widest streets. Look up, no skyscrapers for the eyes to meet. The Washington Monument's the highest peak, but then believe that a rule was put in writing. Nothing shall be taller than the Capitol building. Travel up its steps like dreams and thoughts. See what resembles a Greek temple, the Supreme Court, and the Smithsonian, destination for your travel. World's biggest museum looks like a castle, or there's art to see in the National Gallery. There are many great sights in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to Washington, D.C., this is the place where dreams come true. Yes, the capital of the United States. We'll enter the heart of our nation. We'll see where our bills become law. We'll visit the side of the White House and monuments that bring awe. United States.